here. Okay, so welcome everyone to our Empathy Cafe. This is an ongoing series of Empathy Cafe dialogues with the goal of bridging social and political and personal divides. And we're trying to build a culture of empathy here, which it means that everyone can be heard and seen and acknowledged to their satisfaction, and really to foster constructive dialogue and to see our common humanity, especially around some of these really difficult topics that polarize the country and countries, the world for that matter. And so we're trying to teach people how to take part in these empathy circles as well as to scale them up. We'd like to have take them eventually to Congress, have the US Congress members take part in these. And I've actually talked to 2 Congress members said that they're willing to take part in these. So I'm trying to set that up at the moment. And we'll say to anyone viewing, if you're a viewer of this, that you're invited to take part in future empathy circles as well as to become a facilitator. We're really trying to teach everyone here to become a facilitator as well, and to take it into your own communities, into your families. And you can go to empathycircle.com for more information about how to get involved, as well as if you go down in the description, of these posts, there'll be links to that. So again, want to welcome everyone, and just like to go around just for a short introduction before we divide into 2 groups to have our discussions, our empathy circle dialogues. And just get a sense of who's here, who's in the cafe, what your name is, where you're from, and your political leanings. If you want to say something like if you're pro-choice, pro-life, that might help too, so we can sort people into, so we get a variety of people in each circle. So I'm Edwin Rutch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And politically, I grew up conservative, moved to the progressive side, and now I'm moving to the empathic side. So in terms of pro-choice, pro-life, I come down on the pro-choice side politically. And I'll just select people. I see here in the corner is L. Hittner. I don't know, what is your, I don't know your first name.
Okay, well, the first name is Leslie.
Leslie.
That's where the L comes from. And I grew up conservative as well. My family was a conservative family. I parted from conservatism probably in the mid-90s, and consider myself in the median between the left and the right, in that little safe green space in the middle of a 4-lane highway. So I am politically probably a bit more on the left than on the right. And when it comes to pro-life or pro-choice, I think of myself as both. And when I get a chance to talk, I think I can make that a bit more clear.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Shannon?
Hi, well, I'm Shannon. I am from Canada. I am way probably further left than even most people in the United States, because they're a little bit right from us. On pro-choice, pro-life, though, I'm kind of in the middle. I'm open to listening to what the pro-lifers are arguing. I'm hoping that it's not just, we kill all the women for the babies. I think there's a little bit of middle ground there. So, so I don't really have like a strong stance on that particular topic.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
I'm Susan Campbell, and I live in Sebastopol, California. My political leanings are progressive, and I'm pro-choice.
Bill?
Hi, I'm Bill. I live in Northern California. As I say, I'm on the left, but it's complicated. And I am pro-choice, but I also believe pro-life. And I understand that, and I feel that.
Okay, Teresa?
Hey everybody, I'm Teresa Bukovac. I have lived in San Francisco for the last 12 years. I lean very progressive. I am an atheist. I am a feminist. I do not believe in biblical sexual moral values, but I had a major change of heart on the abortion issue about 10 years ago, well, over several years. And although I identified as pro-choice for many years, I do now identify as pro-life. And I'm the founder and executive director of Pro-Life San Francisco. We're a grassroots pro-life activist organization in San Francisco.
Oh, great. Really glad you're here because it looks like it's going to be more pro-choice and really wanting the pro-life viewpoint. So glad you're here. Carolina?
Hi, everyone. My name is Karolina Kubiak. I'm calling from Poland, Central Europe. I live in Gdańsk, north of Poland, on the Baltic Sea. My political leanings are radical left, but in a Gandhian meaning, in a Gandhian sense of this. I believe Gandhi was very left activist, social activist, and political activist. And so my political view is radical left with Gandhian methods, Gandhian means.
Okay, thank you.
And about pro-choice, pro-life, actually, I am pro-choice, what means to me pro-life.
Thank you. Andreas?
It's Andre.
Oh, Andre.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Andre. I live in Bay Area, California. And it's the first time I'm participating in this, and I'm very much interested in the method of this type of conversation. Honestly, more than in the topic itself, because I think that a discussion between pro-life and pro-choice people are completely pointless, since I don't believe the agreement ever can be achieved. But anyways, I'm participating, and I don't have any political affiliations, but I am Orthodox Christian, and as far as the pro-life, pro-choice, I am obviously pro-life.
Okay. Then thank you very much. Yes, Susan.
I can barely hear Andre.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Your audio seems to be really low. So if there's some way you can increase the volume. Now we don't hear you at all. If you.
Oh, really? How's that?
That helped. Can you speak?
Yeah, but my earbuds are killing me, so I'm gonna take my earbuds off.
Oh, that works. That's great. That's great.
There's probably more of them. So. Okay.
Okay, so let me see. I'm kind of creating the different groups here too. So the next part is the I don't know if you had a chance to see the instructions of how an empathy circle works. The empathy circle is a constructive dialogue process, so it's a structured process. And in this process, we'll have, I guess, 4 people per group. I'll facilitate one, and Susan will facilitate the other one, and that's Susan. And in this process, one person speaks, and they select who they're going to speak to, and you'll have 5 minutes to talk about the topic, whatever comes up for you on the topic. And the person who's listening to you is going to recap, reflect what they hear you say, so that you can feel heard and understood to your satisfaction. And so, and then you'll speak to the person, they'll reflect a little bit, you can speak some more. You want to give them time to reflect back, so it means to pause often to let them reflect back what they hear you say. And if you're the listener, if it's becoming too much to sort of hold what the speaker is saying, you can say, oh, can you pause for a second and let me just reflect back. And so as the tips here is, pause often to give the listener a chance to reflect. When you can speak up to 5 minutes, or if you only speak a few minutes and you're complete, you say, I feel fully heard. And that's just a sign that you're done talking and it's the listener's turn to become the speaker. Then the speaker will choose who they speak to in the group. And we just continue for the 2 hours or an hour and 45 minutes. The last 15 minutes we'll come back into the group and just debrief on how the experience was. And so as the listener, you're wanting to, in your own words, just recap what it is that you heard the speaker say. So you can summarize, paraphrase, you can even use some of the words that they maybe used just to convey your understanding of what the speaker has said to their satisfaction. Because really the goal is for them to feel like you understood what they said. And that's pretty much it. You just kind of learn by doing is really one of the best ways. And we have a facilitator in each group that we just might help keep the conversation and the timing on track. And I'll keep time, and Susan, we'll keep time if you have a timer. And I have just a second. Forgot. I'll hold this up. When the 5 minutes is up, I'll just hold that up so that you know that your time is up. And so when you see that, you're wanting to, you don't have to cut off right away, but you'll want to come to a close, and then we'll, it's not a really super hard, stop, but just that you start wrapping up and, come to a pretty quick close. So with that, we want to get started right away. So I've divided us into groups, and we're going to go into those groups right now. And remember, Susan, to start the recording. And it should be breakout room 1. Oh, great. Okay, welcome. So let me get the timer set up here. Forgot to do that. Stopwatch. And setting it for 5 minutes. So whoever would like to start, you could maybe start speaking to me on the topic of, pro-life, pro-choice, and I will sort of model the reflection. So whoever would like to start, just whatever your views are, what's alive for you on the topic.
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay.
Thanks for hosting this, by the way. So in a nutshell, my opinion on abortion goes like this. I have come to see the concept of a human non-person as one that has been used exclusively to discriminate against mass groups of human beings. I see it as a flesh tax on the poor. I see it as a redistribution of oppression that women and pregnant people in general in our society face. I think it is a failure of society in general.
Okay, well, let me reflect that back. So I'm hearing is you see that that are not seeing I might not be saying this right, but you're seeing this as you called it a flesh tax, and it's an oppression against the poor, and it's not seeing. There was a part there that I sort of was missing, I think, about that seeing. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you could say it again. Yeah, I was really struggling.
So
here.
I've come to see the concept of a human non-person, because that's how we generally treat the unborn in our society. We say that they're not persons. They're humans, but they're not persons.
Oh, okay, so let me get that. So you're saying that we're seeing the unborn as persons, but not human, and that's sort of been a.
It's actually the opposite. So I think in general in the abortion debate, people will say, "Well, sure, you can prove that it's biologically human, but it's not a person. It doesn't have rights." And I'm saying that that concept that someone could be both human but not a person is one that's been used exclusively historically to discriminate against mass groups of human beings
okay.
who are considered non-persons.
Oh, okay. So you can say that this is a human, but it's not a person. And this whole concept of it's not a person is been used to discriminate in all kinds of different environments. So you have concern about that.
Precisely. And then I also have concerns that in general, the most cited reason that those who seek abortion are actually seeking abortion is a lack of financial resources. So that really reflects on the fact, and the 75% of abortions that are done on women under the poverty line. So this is ultimately, I see it as poor women having to give up their children and having to have their offspring terminated in order to continue to live an economically free life. And I feel that that is unjust, and it is a redistribution of that oppression that the people who are poor face onto their offspring.
Okay, so that you're seeing that the abortion is primarily for women who are low income and oppressed, and that this is it's sort of it's putting the onus on that community, and it's just reinforcing the oppression and the oppression to the next generation as well.
That's right. Thank you.
You still have 2 minutes.
Oh,
There's
okay.
more.
Well, in general, I find also that there is a lot of money in taking lives in general, and that applies to abortion as well. And there's very little money or resources in peace and justice movements and in saving lives. And this makes it an extremely uphill battle for those of us who want to protect the right to life, because we are up against enormous financial resources in the same way that often anti-war movements are against the war machine. And that's often how we feel. And we feel like this huge, enormous financial advantage that this industry has over us has helped create this environment that treats pro-life people like we're some kind of flat earth creationists or something, or that we're looked at like we don't know how to employ intelligence or reason, and that we have some mythical religious belief of some kind.
Okay, so you're seeing that the pro-life side is just way outspent. There's just a lot more resources on the pro-choice side, and you're making analogous to the peace movement, so the anti-war movement, that there's huge amount of resources on the military side, and so it's analogous to that, as well as there's sort of a demeaning that takes place, saying that, oh, you're just sort of religious fanatics or something like that. So there's sort of this aspect of demeaning that happens.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So that was, I'll speak to Shannon then, since it's my turn to speak.
Okay. I don't know that I have 5 minutes on this topic.
No, I speak to you and you reflect back what I have to say.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So, I'm pro-choice, and I think it's a very difficult topic, and so I don't have any, there's no, when life starts, I think is sort of unclear. It's like at what point is it a cell and what point is it human? So I think it's just a very difficult, issue. So that's why I just say it's kind of the choice, of the woman to decide.
So you're saying that it's too difficult to tell. It's unclear when. This is hard to do.
Yeah, your best, whatever. Just
a person becomes a person, and it should be up to the woman, because it's so difficult for us as society to determine for other people when to decide that someone is a full human that needs to be considered.
Right. And so I support, the original Supreme Court decision. That seems like, a way of dealing with it. And, as the more we've done one of these circles before, and I start seeing the more the nuances and the issues. And I haven't thought about it that much, but, having these circles, I'm starting to see more of the depth of the, of what's involved. So I appreciate just hearing everybody's views.
So you support the original Supreme Court decision, and after hearing everyone's views, you're starting to appreciate all the nuances of all the various points of view.
Yeah, and the importance of it being a dialogue like we're trying to do here, instead of it's so polarized. I've posted to the Planned Parenthood site, and I've posted invitations to the Students for Life. I mean, it's really just people are like, I'm not going to talk. The other side, is just really bad, and it's just like, why should I even talk to them? They just want to, it's really, they're very it's like people don't want to talk about it, and I'm concerned that it keeps escalating, sort of the and sort of violence and polarization happens.
So what I hear is you're actually that it's getting more and more polarized, or it's always really been polarized, and you think people just talking to each other would help de-escalate the polarization and the tension around it, so that I guess
it doesn't turn into more violence than is already there. Yeah. And so what we're trying to do here is create a context, the structure for holding those, constructive dialogues. So I'm kind of more interested in this context, spreading the value of dialogues, sort of a constructive dialogue. So that's one of my main sort of motivations.
This is hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
So your goal is to spread constructive dialogue. So I get it, not just about this topic, but so that we can okay, I probably wasn't listening that well.
No, that's exactly it. It's just for having constructive dialogue, because if we have constructive dialogue, that means that we can work things through, and, it takes the anger and stress levels down.
Okay, so constructive dialogue takes the stress level down and the anger down, so that there's less violence and polarization and hostility.
And it might create more creativity for finding, common solutions, that maybe there are things we can do to, address some of the issues.
Yeah, and so you think it would create more solutions and open up ideas and stuff like that?
Yeah, I feel very well heard. Thank you very much. So it's your turn to select someone to speak to. And we want to try to make sure everyone has a chance. So maybe Leslie, but it's your choice.
Oh, now I have to think about what I should say.
But first you select someone.
Okay, I'm gonna select Teresa. Is that your name?
Okay.
Right.
So I don't have a lot of thoughts on this particular issue. I was very pro-choice as well. Not that long ago, actually, a couple years ago, and I went to my stepson's house, and his wife had told me a story about how she was going to have a baby that was potentially going to be disabled, although they didn't know. And actually, the baby turned out not to be disabled at all. But the doctors put pressure on her, and separately, apart from her alone, her husband, to abort the child. And she was concerned that abortion, the movement for abortion, was putting undue pressure on women to have abortions when they didn't actually want to have abortion. They were kind of peer pressuring women to have abortions. And it kind of moved me more toward the pro-life camp, so that now I'm in the middle.
Okay, so I think you're saying that you aren't really sure totally how you feel about the issue. A couple years ago, you felt pretty pro-choice, but you went to your stepson's house and spoke with his wife, and she was telling you that they were having, they had a pregnancy where the doctors were encouraging them to have an abortion because there was potential for severe abnormalities. But they chose not to, and they chose life, and the baby was okay. And she felt pretty strongly and expressed to you her frustration with feeling pressured to have an abortion. And
Right.
that kind of made you think a little bit differently about abortion in general, and kind of pushed you a little bit more onto a pro-life side, potentially.
Right.
Great.
So,
Tell me more.
I also was going to say for Edwin, actually, is one of the reasons I'm getting involved in these empathy circles is I'm an atheist as well, but a Buddhist too. And I'm trying to promote a more compassionate, compassion-based church or group, if you will, within the Buddhist community, where we talk empathetically with each other about stuff. And so I'm trying to learn to use this for that ends as well.
So you are also a non-religious person and an atheist, but you are, well, I guess you're a little religious because you're Buddhist. That is a religion, but atheistically. And you're pretty involved in that, and you want to take some of the methods that you've learned here, or some of the skills you learn in this workshop, and taking it to your congregation in terms of building more empathy and compassion and understanding within that community group.
Exactly. That's better than I said. Yeah. So that's really all I have to say, I think.
That's great.
So, Teresa, you choose. Maybe Leslie, since he hasn't.
Yeah,
spoken yet.
Leslie. Oh, and now I talk though again? Okay.
Yes, it's your turn. 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So I talk about abortion a lot, and often it can be very emotionally exhausting for me. I have to justify myself all the time to everyone. And I'm not saying that people don't deserve that justification. They do. But it gets a little bit hard sometimes. And it was actually my friend Anna with Students for Life who did this previously, who encouraged me to do it. And I thought, wow, 2 hours of talking about abortion again. Can't wait. But I really believe in community, and the Bay Area is really important to me. And aside from, creating a more compassionate environment and being involved in these compassionate movements, I'm also an animal rights activist and a vegan, and it's animal rights activism that kind of emboldened me to go out and do real activism on the life issue. Am I going too fast? Do you need me to slow
You might
down?
want to give him a chance to reflect back a little bit.
Okay. Stream
And
of
you're
consciousness.
muted, Leslie. You're muted.
I'm running fast and furiously here, Teresa.
Thank
Um,
you.
I hear that when you get involved in discussions about abortion, they always become very emotional, and that's emotionally draining for you, and you find yourself having to justify to nearly everyone what your stance is in terms of the pro-abortion or pro-life thing, or the pro-choice and pro-life. And you have a friend, Anna, who works for Students for Life, who encouraged you to participate, I think, in this roundtable forum here at the Empathic Cafe. And you did that because you believe in community and you're strongly supportive of the community in the Bay Area, and not only in terms of pro-life and pro-choice, but in terms of animal rights. And you live kind of what you preach in terms of being a vegan. And I think that's where you stopped to allow me to talk.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. You perfectly captured it. Let's see, what else can I say? I was on the topic of, doing this type of event. So like right now, and I was talking about how I believe in community and how important it is, I think, to do these types of things, understanding where people are coming from. Obviously, as a pro-life activist, it's extremely important for me to understand where pro-choice people are coming from on this issue and not just relying on my own experience. Oh, when I was pro-choice, this is what I thought, so that's what all pro-choice people think. I think, obviously, there's a lot of lives affected when we're talking about something as pervasive as whether or not we're going to allow abortion or we're going to restrict abortion. So it's very sensitive, and I want to be a part of understanding that holistically. And also, just in the California community, it's very difficult for pro-life people to exist. We're, like I mentioned before, we're often just kind of treated like we want women to die or something, or we want some kind of, we want to control people's bodies, of course, or all of the other horrible, like worst case scenario things that people throw at us automatically. It's very difficult to deal with. And that's kind of why I choose to participate in things like this, because it is important to give another voice to the pro-life side that's often silenced. And yeah, how much more time do I have?
1 minute.
And specifically right now, there's a bill in the Senate, SB 24, that would force all public universities to supply abortions in California. That means our public institutions in my community will become abortion providers, basically saying they don't give a crap whether I exist. I can just move into the shadows. I'm not welcome in this community anymore. And I push back against that kind of community. And again, another reason why I'm here today. So thank you.
Okay. Well, you welcomed the opportunity to come in and participate in this kind of event, because it would help you to understand the viewpoint of those people who are on the more liberal side of this issue, and to be able to hear those their positioning in a more acceptable, non-argumentative platform. You don't have to rely just on how you transitioned from pro-choice to pro-life and what your mindset was. You can hear how other people's mindsets fit into this discussion. At times you feel that you've been restricted in the way people understand your holistic approach to pro-life, and that in California, I suppose because it's primarily a liberal, or thought of as a liberal state, you feel kind of on the fringe when you come out and talk about pro-life. And you feel particularly concerned about a recent bill, SB 24, that allows or that mandates that public universities provide abortion services, and that at the very least, this skews everything to one side and completely puts you off on the side of society.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, Leslie, your turn to select someone.
Oh, golly. I'll select I know you've been on stage a bit more, but
Oh, me? Did you say Teresa?
yes.
I got you. I got
And
you.
possibly because we are similar but different. So I'm going to be saying some things that you agree with and some things probably that you don't.
Okay.
I grew up as a Roman Catholic, and I still go to Roman Catholic churches, but I'm essentially an atheist. And while I'm religious, I am not theist.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that makes me a Buddhist. And I started out being very, very much the Catholic standpoint of pro-life. But I see this discussion and I say, why does this discussion in our society never end? In some respects, I agree with Andrus. It seems like a discussion between pro-life and pro-choice people is, and I think the fundamental reason is that unlike at the end of life, we haven't figured out what constitutes the start of life as a society. At the end of life, if somebody goes into a coma and eventually they achieve all brain activity ceases, even though everything else is functioning, all brain activity ceases. We have come to an agreement that at that point, the person is dead, that the human being is dead. And the only purpose served in continuing to allow this body to function is to preserve organs for future organ transplants. And almost
you may want to give her a chance to reflect. It gets to be a lot to remember.
So you were raised Roman Catholic and you still kind of identify with the religion. You'll go to church, but you're not a believer anymore. You identify mostly as an atheist. And you feel pretty strongly that most conversations between pro-life and pro-choice people and the debate in general is just kind of not going anywhere. And you feel that since at the end of life, we define life as like a certain level of brain activity. Should that brain activity cease, that person is just a host at that point for organs and not really like we don't recognize a right to life in that situation. So therefore that applies in your mind also to the unborn, I suppose, before they've achieved this like cognitive ability.
Yes. And so I think that these two polarized groups need to come together and talk about that, because unless we solve that issue at the beginning of life in the way that we have solved that issue at the end of life, we're never going to come to an agreement. And as a somewhat of a scientist, I believe in the laws of symmetry, which mean that there is some symmetry to the laws of nature. And so what we see at the end of life in terms of defining the end of the human person, if you want to call it that, would apply similarly at the beginning of life if we can come to a good definition. Now, the 20-week of pregnancy, anywhere from 18 to 20 weeks and thereabouts, is approximately when brainwave activity begins. And between the 15th and the 20th week of pregnancy is also when most of the spontaneous natural abortions of a pregnancy occur. If the pregnancy gets beyond 20 weeks, it will most likely succeed till till a successful birth. But if there's something wrong with the pregnancy, it's usually in the 15th to the 20th week when Mother Nature says, let's start all over again. So I think we could take a learning from that, and if we could develop effective techniques for determining brainwave activity in the fetus, and determining that there is a conscious entity in there besides just a beating heart and a bunch of blood, that could be a point beyond which abortions would never be approved. Right now, because we're so polarized, one group is saying, I want abortions all the way almost until, late term, all the way almost until birth, because they're afraid to give up their position. And the other group says, never.
That was 5 minutes, but should just reflect.
Okay, so you think that one of the ways that we could come together, or one of the ways that we could kind of come to a better consensus on the issue, is if we were to bring pro-life and pro-choice people together to discuss end-of-life issues and how that translates to beginning of life, and having one consistent definition in both of those cases. You find abortion less problematic before 20 weeks, or maybe not problematic at all, because of the lack of particular type of brain waves that occur around that time, or around that gestational age. And you also feel that abortion is probably it is justified before then, also because of the spontaneous miscarriages that happen quite frequently prior to that gestational age. Am I forgetting anything?
No, I think that you kind of got it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome.
You're up again, Teresa.
Oh, I am?
Yep.
And now
As a listener, once you've listened, you become the speaker and you select who you want to speak to.
Okay. Well, I will speak to you, Edwin.
Okay. Listening.
I guess I want to address some of these issues about when life begins and beginning of life, end of life issues, since they came up. I think that in general, science has always recognized when the start of a new organism occurs in any species, in any mammal species, in especially mammalian species that begin as, all of us begin as zygotes. We know this because that's what we try to recreate in an IVF lab. We know when we've created a new embryo. So it's not like, when does life begin? When do we have a new human being? We know when there's a unique strand of DNA that tells us, well, this unique individual has this color eyes, and we know that it's, this is likely how, what its gender will be, or its sex. And so I think that this idea that we don't know when life begins is not a question, is not a biological question. It's a philosophical question. We're not saying, when does a human life begin? We know that. That's what we're creating in an IVF lab. What we're saying is, when does that human life become a person? When does it have value? And I think that that's kind of what Leslie was saying. Well, yeah, it's a human, it's a host, but it doesn't have value until it has these defined brainwaves that can experience consciousness. And I actually think that this is a really compelling argument. It's pretty intuitive, because that is kind of what makes humans special, is our ability to have this conscious experience that seems pretty unmatched with other species. And that's, in general, I think, why we have human rights and things like that, because we value the consciousness, the conscious experience of human beings. Should I stop there?
Yeah, that'd be good. To reflect, just to recap. So you're addressing, like, when does life begin, and you're saying that scientifically, that as soon as there's that life begins at, right at the beginning with the zygote, I think you call it. I'm not sure. Zygote. And so life does sort of scientifically begin at that point. So it's really, where is there sort of a personhood and that is sort of like a philosophical question, and that's what yeah. So that was what I was getting so far.
Okay, and then did you get the part about? Oh wait, I can't remember what I said. Never mind. I'll keep going.
Okay.
See, I talk about this a lot, so I get really confused sometimes.
You talk about it a lot, you get confused sometimes.
That's right. What did I already say to this person? Because I've had this conversation a million
You've gone over this material a lot.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, my position is that, what I was saying about consciousness, I wanted to make sure you got that part, that
Okay.
I understand intuitively why that would matter to someone and why they would find it inconsistent, the way we treat end of life and the way a pro-lifer would approach beginning of life.
So it's about consciousness. Is like, when does consciousness begin, and how does that compare from the beginning of consciousness to the end of consciousness? So you're kind of wanting to address that aspect of consciousness.
Exactly. So I think it's compelling, especially because of the point that Leslie made. But I would say the distinction at end of life is that, and beginning of life is that at the beginning of life, the scenario would be this: if we're actually, I should go back a little bit. I am saying that there is no objective distinction between a human organism and a human person. And I don't think that consciousness is an objective distinction, because I think there are lots of times and cases where people are not fully like having the kind of brainwave activity that a conscious person who's experiencing their universe in our way would have. Like newborns, for example, do not have this level of brainwave activity until about 15 months after birth. And some pro-choicers actually argue that, well, then they wouldn't have a right to life in that case, because they haven't achieved that level of cognitive ability that we generally attribute to like these human-like qualities. And then of course there are people in comas. Like, what if there's a person who's in a coma who is not experiencing any of these like brainwave activities that we would say grant us human rights, and yet this person is expected to recover in say 9 months and live out the rest of their existence? I would think that in that case it would be problematic to say that they no longer have a right to life simply because they lost consciousness or don't have consciousness temporarily.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if the argument is when does consciousness begin, that's very complicated as well. Like, there's people in comas, just because they're not conscious, that they could become conscious afterwards. So just saying that consciousness is where life begins, that it's more complicated than that, because there's a lot of inconsistency. If you say, well, somebody's unconscious, then we can go ahead and, kill them or so, get rid of them. So it just, yeah. That was the 5 minutes.
It's not an objective distinction between the unborn and born.
Okay, so it's not objective. It's not an objective. If you're looking for an objective distinction, that is not an objective distinction between the born and unborn, that quality of consciousness.
Exactly, that would justify abortion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like that would, so saying that they don't have consciousness is not objectively way of saying that to justify abortion. Then
that's right.
Okay, all right.
Do I have any more time, or am I done?
That was it. That was the 5. So it'll come around again. So I'll speak to Leslie. And you're muted. Yeah, it's like one thing from having this discussion, I just see how multifaceted it is. It's like, it's not just like pro-life, pro-choice. It gets really complicated, and there's so many different nuances. And it's like, the more it's like, wow, this is really, so many different facets to this issue. So maybe just reflect that part, recap that.
Well, I think what you're saying is, what I hear you saying is that in participating particularly in this sort of an event, you've come to realize that this discussion is very multifaceted, that there are a lot of nuances to this pro-life and pro-choice discussion.
Yeah, but for me personally, you know, when I was in college, actually, you know, someone that I was with, you know, she actually got pregnant, and she did have an abortion. So it kind of like put it personally, you know, and you know, if she hadn't, that would have been a huge effect, you know, on my life personally, you know, just the responsibilities and everything. So it's like I was pretty grateful that was a possibility. So I'm just, you know, kind of speaking from my own, you know, visceral, you know, qualities of just the impact it would have had on my life. So yeah, so I just guess I wanted to bring that personal aspect into it.
I hear you saying that although you are not necessarily saying that you think abortions are good ideas, that in your personal experience with a friend in college who got pregnant and subsequently had an abortion.
Partner.
Big impact, yes. Your partner that had a big impact on how the rest of your life has carried out, and that you were grateful for what actually happened.
Yeah. So yeah, so that I guess I keep that sort of in mind. I know other people too that, you know, their life would have been so impacted by this, and you know, for me, when I think of, you know, an embryo, you know, like a cell, I mean, there's so many cells. The whole body is full of cells, and you know, it's so for me that's kind of how I see it. Like, well, there's these cells. You know, the sperm. Are we gonna? You could say that, you know, there's life in the. I mean, it's not just life. Because the sperm and egg are cells, and they're alive too. So just because they come together, that, you know, that's like where like a human being starts. So, you know, it's not easy. It's, you know, it's a difficult. I see Teresa shaking her head, but yeah, it's just coming up.
Yeah. You ask a question in essence that there's a sperm and there's an egg, and they come together, and there's that very first early zygote.
Yeah.
Zygote. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. And is that sufficient to define humanity?
Yeah.
Are humans more than skin and bones?
Yeah. Just that.
That's kind of your question.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it is. I mean, I don't think. You know, I don't see it. You know, so. Because then it gets complicated. It's like, is every sperm a life? Because, you know, potentially it could be a life, and the same with an egg, and you know, so it's complicated.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you correctly, your thoughts are that there is more than skin and bones to a human being. That what constitutes a human being is greater than the body. That there is
no. It's the cells. I mean, there's cells, you know, and you know, the body is full of cells. We just have you know, and so it's like, at what point can a cell, you know, become a human being? And you know, at what point, you know, so it kind of drawing, my time's up here. I'm just seeing that. So yeah, so it's kind of complicated, but I guess
there is no point where something happens.
Yeah, well, I'll end it there. I'll come back around later when it's my turn. Yeah, I feel heard. Thank you.
So I guess it's my turn to talk to someone. I'm going to talk to Shannon. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good. It gives me some practice.
Yeah, I assumed that we can kind of add to what we're learning in this cafe. And I wanted to address a little bit what Teresa was saying, because she makes a very good point about consciousness. And it is very objective, or subjective, excuse me, saying that what level of consciousness constitutes humanity. If somebody is in a coma or is a young born baby, doesn't have the conscious awareness that a 12-year-old child does. And that's why my concentration so much is not on a level of consciousness, but on specific measurable levels of brainwave activity, which is similar to what we do at the end of life. Because we can't make a meaningful judgment about someone's consciousness.
So you're saying it's not so much about the level of consciousness, because of course a baby has less consciousness than we do, but more about the level of brainwave activity. The same way we determine when someone has died, we could determine when someone is alive in the first place. Is that right?
Yes, from the human perspective, yes. Because until that brainwave activity is there, that living tissue, other than its DNA, could be identical to many other living creatures in that same stage of development. It would be like comparing my wife's meatloaf to somebody else's meatloaf. The recipes might be different, but they're essentially the same thing. They haven't made that separation into what we could consider a potential human without a brain working.
Okay, so it's not so much being alive, since other living beings don't necessarily have any brainwave activity, but about what we could count as human neurological activity that we're measuring for to determine whether a fetus is starting to be, I guess, a thinking being.
Yeah. I would attribute that same quality to a dog, of a mother, a female dog who is pregnant with puppies, until such time as those puppies show brainwave activity. They are not dogs in terms of having the capability to develop a dog personality. They are still a piece of clay in the making. People seem to find it easy to understand the concept that a two-celled organism isn't a human being. Yet the pro-life people will make that argument, even though it's easy to understand that, quite frankly, a sperm is not that important. It doesn't make that magic change in the egg. It takes more. We are more than that. And we just need to determine where and come to an agreement as a society where that point of separation is.
So even with dogs and other conscious beings like us, you can make this distinction between whether a dog is inanimate cells versus when it's got the brainwave activity to start being like a dog. And there's I'm kind of missing the middle part.
I think, as I said, the people find it easy in concept to understand that a two-celled organism at that early is they find that easy to understand as a concept. But if you're pro-life, you'll argue that it became a human being the moment the sperm impregnated it. And I would just say the sperm isn't that important.
Yeah.
That male sperm should be the determination between human and not human. No, it takes much more than that.
Okay, so yeah, it's like pro-life people are arguing that a two-cell organism or a non-conscious organism is the equivalent of a human life. And I think, sorry, I keep losing my train of
I
thought.
find it very difficult to accept that the sperm is that important. I think human beings are much more than an egg and a sperm. It takes much more to make a human. And we just need to come together as a society and decide when that point is reached.
So
I have proposed that it be the start of brainwave activity.
So a sperm isn't that important. A sperm isn't a human being. So we need to come together as a society to determine where human being starts. It's not at sperm, of course. So you're proposing that brainwave activity be the start of when we decide human life beginning.
Yes, because frankly, you women need to put a lot more work into it before it becomes.
Am I supposed to repeat that?
That was the time too. That was so.
I think it's a kind of a joke.
I feel heard, Shen. Thank you.
So what happens now?
You select who you want to speak to, and you talk about whatever is on your mind for 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll talk to you, Edwin.
Okay.
We've been talking here and addressing what is the common argument that you hear between pro-life and pro-choice people, which is, when does life begin? But what I haven't heard was the same, that Teresa and I brought up a point that hasn't been addressed yet by the pro-choice side, which is the pressure women face to have an abortion if all the stars don't align, if they're not married, if they don't have enough money, and the kind of psychological pressure on us to abort.
So in the discussion so far, you've been hearing sort of like, where does life begin? But what you haven't heard is, well, what about the social pressures on women to have abortions? And you just haven't had that heard that addressed from the pro-choice side.
Yeah, it's a little disconcerting. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and you even feel disconcerting about that, not having heard that. Yes.
Right. Also, though, on the pro-life side, I'm also concerned about, I don't know because I haven't researched this in detail, is that there is a pressure, that people would choose the life of a baby over the life of the mother. What if, pregnancy is always a danger to a woman to some degree, and she may choose not to put herself in the position of being potentially harmed by having a child, even in cases where it's a relatively safe pregnancy. It could still be a danger. And I feel like that's also taking into consideration the woman, and I feel like I haven't heard anything about that either, and I'm concerned about it, at least.
Yeah, so you have concern about, for women that there is a risk in delivering a child, a pregnancy and delivering a child, and you would like to hear some concern or about the woman too for her taking that risk.
Right. That's all.
Okay, so you feel heard, you feel fully heard.
Yes, I feel fully heard.
Okay, I'll speak to Teresa. Yeah, okay, and you're muted. So,
Ready.
yeah, that's something. What Shan was talking about, the pressure women feel, about to have abortions. I wasn't aware of that until the first empathy circle we did with Anna. Talking about it. So there can be all these social pressures, and I don't support putting people under intense pressure like that to make a decision one way or another. I just think that's going to cause a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress, and so I wasn't aware. I don't even think about it, but I became more aware of it, so more appreciative of the concerns around that.
So you're saying that prior to having this forum, you weren't really aware that women face a certain level of pressure, or that they potentially do, when experiencing a pregnancy and determining whether or not to have the child. And you feel like, women should be able to make this decision in a pressure-free environment, and the type of pressure that you just really weren't privy to prior.
Yeah, Anna had talked about like schools, where the whole school pressure, from the administration throughout is like, have this abortion, and you're sort of like intimidated into. She was saying that women might feel intimidated into just doing it, and so I don't think intimidation, is positive either. I would be supporting dialogue like we're having, like a non-stressed, caring, supportive dialogue, in consideration of all the factors for the individual to be able to make their decision in that sort of an environment.
And you're just kind of reiterating what you were saying before, that you just really feel like that does seem unfair to be put in a position where you're being pressured one way or another. You consider yourself truly pro-choice in the way that you want it to just really be an independent decision, not necessarily influenced by the people or groups around them.
And it goes on both sides, because I grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist environment, and from that community there's a lot of pressure too, and you're going to hell, and it gets pretty intense on that side too. So it's in all sides, and I think it's a matter of care, having a sense of care for everyone involved. So I would say So it's
I think that you are truly committed to empathy, and you really want people to be seen and heard, and you don't want other people. You think it's too much of an imposition for other people's opinions to kind of dictate how people are deciding on this issue from both sides. You feel like the pressure comes equally from the pro-choice side on women to stay unpregnant or not having sex. I'm paraphrasing a lot, but what do you think?
No, and carrying the to term. It's like, don't have the abortion, you'll have and you're going to go to hell if you do, and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah,
that's the extremes. Not that everybody does that, but those are kind of the extremes.
Yeah, and you're just pointing out that that there are extreme views on both sides, and while that's not like necessarily the norm in every situation, that's something that some people have had to encounter and deal with, and that's something that you wish wasn't a factor.
Yeah, and so the other thing is like I'm trying to see how do we have more of these empathy circle dialogues. I've reached out. I've gone to pro-life. The Students for Life. I actually went to the founders. Talk. I was there. I listened.
Oh, okay.
In Berkeley. So I've really tried to sort of reach out to the different sides. But even still, it's hard to bring. I'm so glad you're here and that Anna invited you because I talked to her personally there. I said, would you come? And, she did. But it's like, I'm kind of like wondering, and she says, oh, when we can talk to people, we can convince them, about our point of view. And I'm thinking, well, why don't more, people come to the empathy circle? And, so that's kind of a question I'm sitting with. How do we bring more people into these dialogues?
And you're kind of wondering how we can bring more people into these types of dialogues. It seems like, especially pro-life people seem maybe a little underrepresented here.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when you engage with pro-life people, they're like, yeah, we believe we can convince people if we talk to them. And yet they seem so uninterested in engaging in this type of forum. And you just, want some kind of feedback or some kind of, some pointers maybe on what's more effective.
Yeah, I feel very well heard. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, I guess I will talk to Shannon. Gosh, there's been so many things that I want to address and I'll probably forget. But I guess I'm just going to start out quickly with the whole beginning of a life issue. Really quickly, I want to just touch on that I think that there is a very clear scientific distinction between a sperm and a human embryo. And the reason that abortion exists is because we have to kill this particular individual. And I say it like that because I have never seen any other consistent, objective way of defining individuality, human individuality. And what I've come to find, as a vegan and as someone who's constantly asked to justify, how I value life in general, I've found that for human beings, at least, and when we're talking about human rights and who gets human rights, it's not something that we can do or offer to society that gives us value. Because if we're saying, well, you can't do this, you don't have this level of brainwave, then that's an ableist position. But what gives us value is simply being human. Can you paraphrase that? Sorry, that was a lot.
So you're saying that yeah, it's hard to go back and paraphrase.
I can paraphrase it for you if you want.
No. I want to practice doing this.
Okay.
You feel that the genetics or the potential, but genetics are potential to be an individual human.
I really would not say potential. I would say the physical existence of a human organism.
Okay, so the existence of the human organism.
Yeah.
Let's see, back to where I was going.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I've got to get better at this. That's the only way to make a distinction between whether something is human or not. There's no to base it on brainwaves is an ableist position.
Yeah.
We have brainwaves, and even though they're not up to the point of having brainwaves yet, they still have all the components, the physical components to be a human. So, did I miss something?
No, I think that's good. I think that you kind of said it. It's not what we can do that gives us value. It's who we are intrinsically. We are humans. So at any level of development, if we're going to draw a distinction and say, well, you don't get human rights because you're a human, but you don't get human rights because you can't actually do these things, I find that to be discriminatory. And my position as a pro-life person, it comes from my position on feminism and the tenets of feminism, which is equality, nonviolence, and non-discrimination. And I find abortion incompatible with all of those things, regardless of the level of ability or like development that a human organism has achieved.
Okay, so you find it to be to say that someone can't do something is discriminatory, and
If you say they don't deserve rights because
they don't deserve rights because they can't do something is discriminatory against them. And so even though they can't do things yet, they are still they still deserve rights as a person.
Yep, that's it. Gosh. Oh, and I just want to. Oh, I already said the part about sperm and embryo, right? I did make that distinction. That a sperm is not a human organism, and no way in science has that distinction ever been made. It's only in terms of the abortion debate. In any other aspect of science, we know exactly when we have a brand new human organism or new organism of any kind. But when we get into abortion, it's like, oh, well, I don't know. We don't really know when life begins. Well, we do, but we have to determine when we value it. And that value has to remain consistent for all human beings.
So you're saying nowhere in, I don't know why I'm saying you're saying, it's true, nowhere in science have we ever said that a sperm is an organism until we get into the abortion debate, and then all of a sudden we're reducing it to a sperm. And I forget, and then you said something after that.
I think you got the concept though.
Okay.
That's the distinction I'm trying to make. And I want to touch a little bit. Do I have any more time, by the way? Oh, okay, never mind.
He'll come around.
Sorry, no problem. Oh, now I pick someone to talk. No.
Shannon was the listener, so it's now her turn.
Okay.
Oh, shoot. I'm sorry, I don't have anything really to say.
You can select someone, and then you can say, I have nothing to say. They will reflect back, and then you can say, I feel fully heard, and then it'll be their turn.
Okay, I'll just select you then.
Okay. So I'm hearing you have nothing to say.
Right.
Is there more?
No, I feel fully heard.
Okay, you feel fully heard. Okay, then I'll speak to Leslie. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, the story that's coming to mind is last year, my partner, her mother had a cerebral hemorrhage, and with the cerebral hemorrhage is like, just kind of wipes out a large part of your brain function, and you can't respond. So this was back east, we flew out there, and what they do is they pretty much take the person to hospice, and they just don't, if you have a brain hemorrhage like that, she was also in her 90s, that they don't give you food, and they don't give you, water, and you basically, dehydrate and, starve to death.
Well, what I'm hearing you say is that in terms of addressing the end-of-life issues, your partner's, was it mother or?
Her mother, yeah.
Yeah, had a cerebral hemorrhage, and most of her brain function was destroyed, and she was taken to hospice. in hospice. She was not given water or food and was left to die.
Mm-hmm. And that's just, yeah, and that's just kind of what's done, because the person is totally, they can't eat, they can't respond, they just have no, you know, they're alive, but they're, you know, there's just no, you know, clear brain, you know, function. They can't relate, they couldn't eat. And it took, I think we were there for like 9 or 10 days. It was like amazing how long it takes for someone to, you know, pass away. And, you know, there's this will, this bodily function of just sort of living and going on, even without that, you know, that deeper consciousness and awareness.
So apparently they did not declare her dead, and so they went through this period of time without clear brain functioning, and she was unable to relate to people in the room. She was unable to take her own food, and that this process lasted 9 to 10 days, just living and going on and doing nothing. Passed.
Yeah. And when she first was taken to the hospital, they given her, you know, the fluids. You know, they put the fluid bag. I can't remember what they call it, but they, you know, had given her that, and that was actually, I think that was probably what kept her alive for several extra days. Was, you know, having that, and she could have been kept alive for, you know, I don't know if indefinitely by just doing, intravenous, you know, feeding, but it would have been, that would have been it. There would be no consciousness, no hope. It's like the brain functions, or the hemorrhage just destroys that. So I don't know, it seems to be that we're talking, this is kind of relevant to the, you know, to just what is consciousness at what point, and it's just the fact that at end of life, you know, that's kind of the stuff that happens. There's murky sort of areas, and you know, they gave her, you know, morphine to, you know, try to be sure there was no, you know, pain, even though she might not have been, you know, conscious of it. So it's just like, you know, so it's just so difficult, all of these different, you know, decisions and choices, and I think it was the right thing to do. I couldn't see doing anything else. So yeah, so I guess I just wanted to share that story.
So there is a murky area there, and although they gave her fluids through IVs to bring up the fluids that had apparently gone down during this whole process.
Oh no, they gave her the fluids when she first arrived in the hospital, because they didn't know she had a hemorrhage.
Okay.
So it's just that bag of fluids that kept her going for days. You know, if they would have known, they wouldn't have given her the fluids, and she would have passed, you know, several days sooner. But I mean, to be just laying there for no fluids, no food for 9 or 10 days, it was just like.
Okay, so the fluids actually extended it out to 9 or 10 days. It might not have lasted that long, would it not have been for those fluids. But it led you to an area, it just seemed murky in terms of, was she alive, was she not? They gave her morphine in case she was experiencing pain, that the morphine would reduce that, but doctors didn't really know whether she was feeling pain at that point. And that there were a lot of decisions and choices that you had to make, and it was a very difficult time for you.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm also wondering if Teresa has any personal stories about, you know, this issue. I'd be curious, you know, about what her personally stories are.
So you are curious about whether Teresa has some specific stories about these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I feel fully heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, perhaps I should talk to Teresa then, so that she can address some of those issues. Um, it is murky, and even though we've come to a fairly strong agreement socially and medically about these end of life issues, it's still murky. We haven't even begun to address the beginning of life issues. We're sitting at the extremes of positioning on beginning of life issues, but we haven't begun to address any issues at all involving a physical manifestation of something in the developing fetus that would indicate personhood or consciousness or something like that. We haven't begun to really talk about that as a society.
So you think that these issues are extremely murky, especially when we're making comparisons between beginning of life and end of life, that we've come to some kind of consensuses about end of life, but that it's still difficult and these conversations still need to happen. And then you said something about, sorry, what was that last part again?
Where did I stop? That we haven't begun to tackle those discussions, those kinds of discussions for determining that symmetrical activity that happens at the beginning of life.
So you see the beginning of life and end of life issues as symmetrical, and you think as a society, we need to come together and kind of identify that thing that kind of animates us or gives us the value that you see in human beings.
Yes. There was some talk earlier today about the undue pressure on women to have an abortion, and the pressure on the pro-life side to choose the baby over the mother. And those are all social pressures that I believe have been intensified because we don't have any kind of an agreement about what's going on in those first month, in that first 2/3 of a month of a pregnancy. And until we arrive at an agreement about what's going on, I guess I'm pro-choice for 15 to 20 days. After that, I'm pro-life. And as a society, we haven't come up with a Fisher cut bait date. If you recognize that term.
Yeah, yes. So because the issue is so contentious and because people are so divided on the issue and are not in agreement about what the nature of this unborn entity is and when it becomes valuable, this creates all kind of societal pressures where we have women pressured into abortions or women pressured into maybe keeping an unwanted pregnancy simply because we are in disagreement about when said life becomes valuable.
And I would tend away from the word valuable. I think valuable has social baggage that I don't intend in this discussion. But when there's a tipping point in terms of that fetus and its humanity, and I prefer not to use the word valuable because that has social context that I'm not speaking of here. I'm not talking about humanity.
So you prefer not to use the word value because it kind of sounds a little, it's a little problematic because we're almost saying, it sounds a little too utilitarian. Is that a good summary?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It sounds a little too utilitarian, and you prefer just kind of like, you want us to have this consensus societally on what animates us, what gives us our human-like qualities, and when that point occurs.
Yes, and I understand that we're not going to have 100% of us are going to be on that same page, just as we aren't at the end of life issues. I mean, we've all read about articles. There was a woman in Florida, there was a big fight between their family, amongst their family, about whether or not to pull plugs. So we're not going to eliminate all of that uncertainty. But as a society, we could then base laws and regulations and behaviors in the medical establishment based on some sort of common understanding about what we're using at the beginning of the whole process.
So you really believe that if we come together and we kind of hash this out and come to some kind of consensus, although we won't be able to, come to a perfect agreement on things, but we will come to some kind of massive understanding where there's a shift in the way culture understands this issue. And then we can build policy and a culture from that core understanding.
Because I really am fearful of where the direction is we have now, because there are late-term abortions going on that I think are murder. And we're allowing that because we haven't got any meaningful agreement back towards the beginning. Everybody's in the shoulders of the highway, and nobody's walking, holding hands in the middle. Thank you.
So you don't really see birth as the defining point in what it makes us, gives us that human-like quality. And for that reason, late-term abortion makes you uncomfortable like it does most Americans. And you think that the society has just kind of embraced late-term abortion because they're afraid to dig deep into this beginning of life issue and really just coming to some kind of consensus on that. And that coming to a consensus on that will eliminate or help us to address the problem that you perceive of late-term abortion.
Yes. Thank you. I feel heard.
Great. Well, I picked everybody else, so I'll pick you, Leslie. So you're going to get to talk again. Okay, let me think. So I guess I will talk about the coercion thing because that's come up a bit and I have not really addressed it very much. But I do think that, from a feminist perspective, I think that abortion has generally mostly served the interests of men, and that it has created an environment for those of us who can get pregnant to be in a very disadvantaged position should we find ourselves pregnant, because the expectation is, well, if you can't, afford it, you don't have a job, you don't have resources, you're not married, then your option is abortion. So that's your choice. And so ultimately it's created this situation where women feel like they don't have a choice, that abortion is what they have to choose because society and everyone around them finds it shameful, finds pregnancy shameful in circumstances that are less than ideal. And that idea of pregnancy being shameful is ultimately perpetuated by a culture that promotes abortion.
Okay. You're concerned about the coercion that really does exist in our society. And to literally force women into an abortion rather than making it a free choice. And that abortion ultimately in our society serves the interests of men. And if you can't raise the kid, if you can't guarantee that the child is going to have a healthy life, then get an abortion because you're all by yourself. Women feel like they don't have a choice, and that the undesired pregnancies, out of wedlock pregnancies, principally, I would rather imagine, are shameful. And so you You get rid of it. In some cases, you don't even admit that you ever were pregnant, I would expect. It's that kind of shame. And we have a culture that promotes that kind of response to an unexpected pregnancy.
Thank you. Yes, ultimately, I think that pregnancy is something that women end up having to deal with on our own. And I don't mean to exclude trans women. I know that, or trans men who experience pregnancy. So I don't want to be so gender specific, but I'm just speaking kind of broadly when I say women and pregnancy. But the burden of pregnancy is on us, even if we decide to have an abortion. And we carry that experience with us throughout our lifetimes if that's the case. So ultimately, that pregnancy is it oppresses women. It oppresses people who can become pregnant in our society, because the expectation is, well, you only bring that child to term if you have the resources to do it. And that's why I see an act of discrimination, that we are discriminating against a group of people in order to try to help the discrimination that another group is experiencing. And while I don't deny the oppression that, you know, pregnant people are facing, to then have a culture that promotes abortion as a solution is literally just redistributing that oppression that they're facing onto another group of humans. And that oppression is lethal. And it's almost always done through a dismemberment process. Oh, I'm going to have you repeat back to me now.
Yeah, and you were pixeling out a little bit in the connection.
Oh, okay.
But I think I got the essential of it. Ultimately, pregnancy is the women are on their own when it comes to pregnancy, and even if a man is standing by his woman, it's her burden. And you're not intending to exclude trans people that are involved in that. You're saying women in general. And that the burden is on us either way. And we carry that with us. If we have an abortion, we carry that experience with us for the rest of our lives, the women do. And so it is an oppression. It oppresses women and other people without resources, who don't have the resources to deal with the pregnancy, to deal with the child who will be born. And so it's that kind of discrimination again against poor people. And adding abortion as a solution kind of redistributes that same oppression to the fetus, and the fetus has forced to pay the ultimate price. Then there was some pixeling in your audio, but I think you were talking about the abortive process itself and how it oftentimes involves dismemberment of the fetus.
That's right. Thank you. How much time do I have? Okay. That's right. I find the procedure is an act of violence, even if our intentions are to, create a better world, and make sure that no children are having terrible lives. But ultimately, we're making that decision for them by not just letting them die, but we're actively dismembering them. Most abortions are done this way, through suction or a D&E, but it's usually done through a dismemberment procedure. And I find that extremely unjust. I find it to be an act of violence that most Americans are unwilling to consider or to look at through that lens.
Okay. is an act of violence. It is principally an act of violence. And particularly since most procedures are done that way. And I gather by the way you said that that's not true for all abortions. And perhaps that's something that as a society we need to look at. But as it stands, it is the most vilest of things to do and unjust, and most Americans refuse to even acknowledge that.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
It'll be about 4 minutes for you, Leslie, because we'll be going back into the main group.
Okay. Well, I've learned.
Who are you speaking to?
Who am I speaking to? I'll speak to you, Edwin.
Okay.
Since it's probably going to be end. I've learned a lot during this session about how people think about the act of abortion, and Teresa's concerns about the actual way in which the abortion is carried out, I think is very important. And perhaps if abortion is to continue, that's something that we need to look at, is exactly how that sort of a procedure is carried out. It's kind of like if you're going to execute somebody in prison, there seems like there's easy ways and difficult ways, and we haven't been able to even figure that out. But it seems to me that as a society, we have to come to some sort of understanding, or as Andreas said right at the very beginning before we split up, it is a conversation that goes nowhere forever. And I certainly would like to see us as a society come to some sort of resolution about abortion. And I don't think either side of the road is where we're going to find that resolution.
Okay, so what I was hearing there is that you've learned a lot from this discussion, hearing where everyone is on it. And the part that Teresa was talking about, the violence of how an abortion happens, that you have concern about that and would, want to address it, just as there is, with the death penalty executions, like there's different ways of doing it, that there would need to be a less violent way of doing it. So that was like a concern. And that you would like to come to some sort of a move towards some sort of a resolution, or come to some kind of a more of a consensus and mutual understanding within the society. And like Andreas was mentioning, because otherwise this is going on and on and on. So, and it sounds like you think the core part is people that agreeing sort of when life begins, like not life, but sort of when awareness and consciousness begins. And so kind of that is the area where you see the most potential for having agreement.
Yes, and abortions aren't going to go away regardless of how the laws change. They're just going to go into the alley. And I think that's another reality that we have to face. And so if they're going to be, they should be safe. If they're going to be, they should be as compassionate as we can make them. If they're going to be, we should set guidelines as far as when to make those decisions and when that decision is no longer makeable.
So I got a little distracted here dealing with some of the technical stuff, so sorry about that. So the abortions are going to happen anyway, so you're concerned that they happen in a caring, compassionate way, because even if the laws were to change, they would still happen. And so, that sort of reality needs to be addressed in a caring way. And I think that's going to be the time, just because we need to get back with the rest of the group. And I was just noticing, I'm not sure what happened to the rest of the group here. So I hope they're going to be there. So we're going to go back to the main group now and thank you everyone for having taken part in this part of it. So let's see. I'm going
Thank
to
you.
close all rooms. And then you see something pop up, return to main session.
Back, okay.
When I got back, I said, oh, I'm alone.
No, we're here.
Oh, okay. I saw something strange was happening in your group. People weren't there. It was showing some strange things. What happened?
We were waiting for you, so we decided to take a bio break. Andre took a bio break, and the rest
I
of us.
was the initiator. Right.
Oh, okay. I kind of need one too. I'm feeling kind of flattery here. Okay, so we're going to stop the recordings and